I stayed with my husband for the kids and everything changed. I always believed love could survive anything, even silence, even resentment. But I never imagined that staying for the kids would teach me lessons no marriage book ever could. There was a quiet in our house that no laughter could break. I told myself it was for the children, that our home needed a roof, meals, stability, yet each night I felt the weight of something unspoken pressing down on my chest. My mornings began the same, coffee in hand, pretending that everything was normal. I smiled at the children, tucked them into their routine, and whispered to myself that one day, maybe, this pretense would become real again. At first, the sacrifices felt small, foregoing arguments, swallowing my pride, nodding when he was wrong. I thought these were tiny tokens of compromise, harmless gestures in the service of keeping our family intact. But the tiny gestures accumulated. I started losing fragments of myself, memories of who I was before we became a team solely for our children. I could almost hear my own laughter fading into the walls. There were nights I cried silently in the bathroom, hoping no one would notice. I didn't want them to see that the woman who fed them, comforted them, and kissed their scraped knees could also feel so utterly alone. Friends would ask why we stayed together. I'd offer vague smiles, explain that marriage is work, that divorce is messy, that the children needed both parents. But inside, I often wondered if I was simply too afraid to face the unknown. Each holiday, each birthday, became a careful performance. We clinked glasses, shared jokes, exchanged pleasantries. The children laughed, unaware that their parents were barely holding on by threads of civility. I began keeping a journal, filling pages with confessions I could share with no one. I wrote of loneliness, of lost dreams, of nights spent imagining a life where my choices didn't revolve around someone else's comfort. It was during one of those nights, the house silent except for the soft breathing of the children, that I realized something crucial. Staying for them was no longer the selfless act I had imagined. It had become my own trap. I remembered our first date, how we laughed until our sides hurt, how he made me feel alive. That woman seemed a stranger now, buried beneath years of obligation and compromise. And yet, leaving felt impossible. Who would tell the children the truth? That their world had shifted? That love was messy? That sometimes adults fail even when they try their best? There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when he would touch my hand, smile without resentment, and I felt the old warmth stir. But those moments were shadows, brief sparks, in a life otherwise dimmed. I started to notice the quiet courage of mothers around me, women who had chosen themselves but still kept their children at heart. I envied them, hated them, and longed to join them in their freedom. My body began to remember tension as a constant companion. Every meal, every school drop-off, every bedtime routine carried weight. An invisible ledger of sacrifices tallied against an invisible debt of happiness. Sometimes I whispered to the ceiling, asking for guidance, for a sign that I was doing the right thing. And sometimes the ceiling answered with silence so loud it made my ears ache. I realized that staying for the kids didn't guarantee them happiness. It guaranteed stability, yes, but not love, not warmth, not the joy that comes from watching two parents who actually care for one another. There were moments of resentment, subtle and bitter. A harsh word, a door slammed too loudly, a sigh too heavy. Each incident carved small grooves into the foundation of the home I had worked so hard to maintain. And yet, I stayed. Not out of love, not even obligation at times, but because the thought of unraveling everything we had built filled me with a terror I couldn't name. Then came the night I overheard my daughter speaking to her brother, saying she wished we were happier, that she wished Mommy and Daddy smiled more. The words struck me like lightning. The children felt the tension, even if they could not name it. That night, I cried on the couch while he slept beside me, a man I once loved more than life itself. I realized that my choice had consequences far deeper than my own heart. I began small changes, tiny acts of honesty, admitting when I was hurt, expressing needs I had long buried, acknowledging that marriage is not just about survival, it is about connection. Slowly, he noticed. And slowly, he began to change, too. We didn't solve everything, but for the first time in years, our home felt less like a performance and more like a real family. There were arguments, of course. Old habits die hard. But now, after the storm, there was conversation. There was listening. There was compromise that felt mutual rather than coerced. I learned that love is not merely staying. Love is fighting for connection, for understanding, even when the past has hardened hearts and patience is worn thin. The children began to notice subtle shifts, too. Laughter returned in small bursts. They felt safe, not because we were perfect, but because we were trying. I realized that staying without honesty is cruelty. It creates a home of appearances, where children may feel secure in structure but not in the warmth that only genuine love provides. One evening, my son asked me if we would ever separate. I took his small hand, looked into his wide eyes, and explained that sometimes adults make mistakes, but that we were working to be better, together. That conversation became a turning point. I understood that staying for the kids only works if staying also includes growth, change, and emotional presence. I reflected on my own mother, who had stayed in a marriage devoid of communication, and I understood the legacy. I had almost repeated a cycle of silence and compromise disguised as love. I wanted to break the cycle, to show my children that love requires effort, honesty, and courage, not just presence. That sometimes the bravest act is facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Slowly, I allowed myself joy again. Not the careless joy of youth, but the tender joy of being seen, being heard, being alive in the company of those you care for most. He began to participate more consciously, noticing my fatigue, asking about my feelings, apologizing without prompting. Small gestures, yes, but monumental to someone who had almost forgotten the language of love. We started date nights again, awkward at first, but gradually warm. Conversations that had been lost to routine returned, honest and raw, filled with laughter and occasional tears. I realized that staying for the kids can be a catalyst for rediscovery, but only if both partners are willing to evolve, to confront past grievances, to step into vulnerability. I shared more with the children, age-appropriate truths about emotions, resilience, and the value of honesty. They began to understand that marriage is messy, that parents are human, but love can still thrive. It was not a perfect transformation. There were setbacks, moments of despair, nights when the past felt heavy again, but the foundation was stronger, because it was built on authenticity rather than fear. I began to see myself not as a martyr, but as a participant in life's complex dance, capable of mistakes, capable of growth, capable of joy. Our home became warmer, not because problems disappeared, but because we faced them together. No longer pretending that everything was fine while simmering in resentment. I learned the importance of saying I love you, even when it feels fragile, even when it's hard. Words gain power when paired with effort and presence. My children noticed the subtle shifts. They began to confide in us, to laugh freely, to feel the emotional security that had been missing for years. I realized that staying for the kids without changing myself was selfish, not selfless. True sacrifice is growth, not endurance alone. Slowly, the walls between us crumbled. Not entirely, not completely, but enough to allow light, warmth, and the laughter of a real family to return. I understood that love is iterative. It requires patience, forgiveness, courage, and sometimes the audacity to hope when hope feels impossible. Our marriage did not survive by mere presence. It survived because we committed to honesty, to vulnerability, and to seeing each other as people deserving of love and respect. I learned that sometimes staying is right, sometimes it is wrong. The difference lies in whether staying inspires growth, connection, and authenticity. The children grew more confident, more empathetic, more understanding. They witnessed their parents' struggles and triumphs, learning that life is complex but manageable, with love and effort. I began to dream again, to imagine possibilities beyond mere survival. I imagined a family filled with shared joy, mutual respect, and conscious love. He and I started appreciating the small things again, a cup of coffee together, a shared glance, a smile that lingered longer than habit dictated. I realized that staying for the kids can either chain you to despair or guide you to transformation. The choice lies in awareness, effort, and courage. My heart softened toward him, not blindly, not naively, but with the recognition that humans are flawed and that love requires patience and intentionality. We sought help when needed, from counselors, friends, and mentors. Guidance reinforced that marriage is not a static state, but a journey of mutual discovery. I reflected often on the years I felt trapped, realizing that those years taught me empathy, resilience, and the depth of emotional endurance. I shared my story with friends, not for pity, but to inspire conversation about honesty, sacrifice, and the importance of growth in marriage. I realized that staying does not guarantee happiness, but engaging with intention can create a home where love is tangible and felt. My children began to smile more, not just at presents or play, but at the security of a home where love was active, not dormant. I learned to listen deeply, to speak truthfully, to embrace discomfort as a path toward connection rather than avoidance. I recognized that my own expectations were sometimes unreasonable, that marriage is not a fairy tale, but a daily commitment to try again every day. Nights became times of reflection, conversation, and quiet connection. The silence that once suffocated us now felt restorative, filled with unspoken understanding. I realized that the act of staying had been transformed. It was no longer about obligation, but about active choice, about intentionally creating love and stability. We celebrated small victories, like honest conversations. Laughter returned to the dining table, and hugs were no longer perfunctory, but sincere. I learned that marriage can survive hardship when both partners are willing to adapt, grow, and see each other's humanity clearly. The children thrived in this environment, witnessing imperfection paired with effort, learning that love is a verb, not merely a feeling. I embraced self-compassion, recognizing that I had done my best with the knowledge I had at each stage of life. We rekindled intimacy, not superficially, but in ways that honored emotional connection, trust, and shared vulnerability. I learned that staying for the kids can be noble or misguided, depending on whether personal growth accompanies the decision. My story became one I could share without shame, a testament to perseverance, reflection, and the transformative power of honesty. I realized that love sometimes requires courage greater than that needed to leave, a courage that challenges comfort, complacency, and fear. Our home became a laboratory of emotional resilience, where mistakes were acknowledged, apologies were offered, and lessons were learned collectively. I noticed the subtle joy in the children's eyes, the warmth in their laughter, the security in their trust. It affirmed the effort was not in vain. I found forgiveness for myself, for him, and for the years lost in quiet despair, transforming regret into wisdom. We rebuilt routines with intention, creating traditions that reflected love, understanding, and mutual respect. I realized that staying for the kids was only part of the equation. Staying for ourselves, with honesty and vulnerability, completed the circle. Conversations about feelings became regular, expectations were clarified, and grievances addressed before resentment could fester. I began journaling again, but now with hope, documenting progress, moments of joy, and lessons learned from struggle. Our family dinners were no longer silent. They became spaces of sharing, laughter, occasional debate, and heartfelt connection. I discovered that emotional honesty is more powerful than polite compromise, that vulnerability breeds closeness, not weakness. I reflected on the courage it took to stay actively, rather than passively, and realized that growth is often disguised as hardship. The children began emulating empathy, patience, and kindness, absorbing the lessons we consciously modeled, proving that active love is contagious. I learned to celebrate progress, no matter how incremental, understanding that transformation is a journey, not a sudden revelation. I forgave past mistakes, both mine and his, releasing resentment that had once poisoned our home. I realized that staying is only meaningful when it involves conscious effort, emotional presence, and the willingness to evolve together. We created memories intentionally, vacations, game nights, storytelling, embedding love in experience, not just habit. I understood that my children's well-being was never about perfection, but about authenticity, care, and shared vulnerability. I discovered that the act of staying could either imprison or liberate, depending on the courage to confront fear and cultivate love. Our home became a place where mistakes were met with dialogue, not silence, and where love was expressed in words, actions, and presence. I began mentoring friends through similar struggles, sharing the hard truths, emphasizing effort, honesty, and the necessity of growth. I realized that marriage is not a static contract, but a living, evolving relationship that demands courage, empathy, and reflection. Looking back, I understood that staying for the kids was only part of the equation. Staying for ourselves, with honesty and vulnerability, completed the circle. And now, years later, I can say that our marriage survived not because we endured, but because we chose, consciously, to love, grow, and nurture together for ourselves and for the children we love so fiercely.